It had been a carefully planned interview, a moment for Karolina Leavitt to share her values, her faith, her conservative perspective on national television. The Ellen Show, one of the most watched talk shows in America, had invited the young press secretary on stage, ostensibly to discuss her work and the current political landscape. But Karoline had no illusions about what this moment could become. She knew Ellen, the queen of daytime television, wasn't inviting her on for a friendly chat. The tension simmered beneath the surface, and Karoline could already feel it, the unspoken difference between who they were and the line between politics and entertainment. Ellen's audience, a mix of liberal, progressive, and celebrity-driven fan bases, was known for its light-hearted banter, its cultural takes, and its sharp critiques. Yet Karoline wasn't here to play the game that Ellen had mastered. She wasn't there to joke or smile politely while being roasted. No, she was there to stand her ground, a poised figure who had weathered much more hostile environments than a late-night talk show set. The cameras rolled, and Ellen's signature smile beamed through the screen. "Karoline, welcome," Ellen said in her upbeat tone, leaning forward in her chair. "I'm really excited to talk to you today. You've been a bit of a lightning rod for controversy lately. How does that feel?" Karoline's heart beat steadily in her chest, but she didn't flinch. She knew Ellen was looking for a reaction, something to latch onto, a misstep, but Karoline wasn't about to give her that. "It feels like a responsibility," she said calmly. "When you stand for something, you're going to face criticism. But that doesn't make you back down. It makes you stand firmer." The crowd seemed to respond quietly, their applause muted. But Karoline didn't need the validation of claps. She wasn't here to impress them. She was here to make a statement. Ellen didn't give up so easily. "That's admirable," Ellen said, her voice oozing with the subtle mockery she often used to disarm guests. "But you have to admit, you don't exactly make it easy on yourself. Your faith, your values, they're polarizing. And in today's world, don't you think those things make you a target? Especially in politics." Karoline's eyes didn't leave Ellen's. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. "Faith is personal," she replied. "But for many Americans, it's not just personal. It's something they live by every day. You can mock it, but you can't erase it." Ellen's smile faltered for a moment, and the crowd shifted uneasily in their seats. The host pressed on, trying to regain control. "I'm not mocking it, Karoline. I just think it's important to question how those values play out in today's society. How do you respond to critics who say your brand of faith doesn't leave room for others, that it's exclusionary?" The question was sharp, meant to provoke, meant to catch Karoline off guard, but Karoline was prepared. "Faith should never be about exclusion," she answered, her voice calm but resolute. "It's about love, understanding, and respect. It's the same way we stand for our flag, our country, and our soldiers. Those things don't make us better than others. They just make us who we are." Ellen paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. She had expected more of a reaction, more tension. But Karoline's calmness unsettled her. The studio lights seemed to dim slightly as the energy in the room shifted. The audience, who had been laughing and applauding just moments ago, now felt the undercurrent of something deeper. It wasn't just a celebrity interview. It was a collision of ideals. Karoline wasn't here to be a footnote in Ellen's world. She was rewriting the script. Ellen leaned forward again, this time her voice taking on a sharper tone. "Well, maybe," she said, her words now a little more pointed. "Maybe what you believe just doesn't fit into the narrative we're living in right now. I mean, millions of Americans do share your views, right? But they're the minority, aren't they? So, at some point, don't we have to ask ourselves if we're pushing too far?" Karoline's expression didn't change. She wasn't fazed by Ellen's attempt to twist her words. "Maybe the narrative is the problem," she said simply. Maybe the world is too focused on tearing down what makes us strong instead of celebrating it. The moment hung in the air, heavy with tension. The camera zoomed in, capturing every word. The audience, which had been carefully curated by Ellen's producers, was now divided. Some were nodding, some were silent, but the air in the studio felt thick with anticipation. Karoline had just set the stage for something much larger than a simple talk show appearance. But it wasn't until Ellen threw her next question that things truly shifted. "But what about the cross you wear around your neck, Karoline? Do you really think that symbol belongs in a political space?" At that moment, Karoline's hand subconsciously went to the cross around her neck. It wasn't just a symbol. It was her statement, her belief. "Yes," she said, her voice low but filled with conviction. "I do. It belongs everywhere because it's a part of who I am. And if that offends someone, that's not my problem. It's theirs." Ellen's eyes flashed, a quick twitch in her expression. She wasn't expecting this. She had assumed she could nudge Karoline into a defensive position, but Karoline was far from defensive. She was unshakable. The moment had arrived. And as Ellen attempted to push further, to bring the conversation back into her control, Karoline's voice rang out, calm but piercing. "Millions of Americans wear a cross. Millions pray quietly before work. Millions stand for the flag and bow their heads in grief when soldiers come home draped in it. If those things make us a punchline in your world, then maybe the joke's not on us." The words hit hard. A silence fell over the audience, and for a split second, it felt as if the room had stopped. The control room's panic button was pressed in real time. The energy had shifted irreparably, and Karoline's quiet power was now undeniable. Twitter exploded in real time. Within moments, jocker Ellen mocked Karoline. Claps back. "We're trending nationwide." But it was too late. The damage had already been done. The narrative was no longer Ellen's. It was Karoline's. The moment the cameras cut to the commercial break, the studio erupted in murmurs. Behind the scenes, the crew scrambled to contain the fallout from the confrontation that had just taken place. Ellen's producers exchanged tense looks as they swiftly moved to reset the tone for the next segment. But nothing could erase the impact of Karoline's words. On social media, the story was already spreading like wildfire, trending under the hashtag #Karolina Leavitt takes on Ellen. Karoline stood in her spot, motionless, her back straight and her expression unreadable. Her calm, unwavering demeanor had rattled the host, but it had also left the audience unsure of how to respond. The usual applause and laughter had turned into hesitant claps and awkward silence. The studio felt colder, the air heavier. Ellen, ever the professional, knew how to handle adversity. But this was different. This wasn't just about politics. It was about personal values clashing in a way that would leave scars on both sides. As the cameras were reset, Karoline noticed Ellen fidgeting in her seat, her eyes locked on her. The silence between them was palpable. Ellen cleared her throat and forced a smile, trying to regain some control. All right. That was quite a moment," she said, her voice a little tighter than before. "Let's lighten things up a bit, shall we?" But Karoline wasn't going to let the tension slip away so easily. She had just exposed the undercurrents of this entire system, where the values she held dear were treated as jokes or relics of the past. There was no going back now. She couldn't afford to back down, not now, not when so many people were watching. Ellen's next attempt was more calculated, more subtle. She leaned in, her voice softer now, almost coaxing. "You know, Karoline, you're a woman of principle. I admire that. But I have to ask, what about the voices of others, the people who might feel excluded by those principles? What do you say to them?" Karoline could feel the bait, the careful setup designed to expose a crack in her armor. But she wasn't about to be drawn into that trap. "I've spoken to thousands of Americans, Ellen. They don't feel excluded. They feel empowered. It's not about me versus them. It's about building a society where we can disagree but still respect one another, where we don't silence the voices of people just because they don't fit a particular narrative. Ellen's smile wavered again. This was no longer a friendly exchange. It was an ideological war. And as much as she wanted to pivot, to throw in a joke or lighten the mood, the stakes had become too high. The conversation wasn't going to end with a punchline. It was going to end with a statement, one way or another. Before Ellen could respond, Karoline continued, her voice unwavering. We live in a time where everything is about fitting in, about belonging to a certain group. But real courage comes from standing alone when you believe in something. And that's what I'm doing. I'm standing by my faith, by my principles, by my country. The room fell silent again, as if the weight of her words had hit everyone at once. The tension was so thick, it could almost be felt physically. The audience shifted uncomfortably, their divided loyalties hanging in the air like a cloud. On one side, there were those who found themselves agreeing with Karoline, resonating with her unwavering stance on her beliefs. On the other, Ellen's followers, a younger, more progressive crowd, struggled to reconcile the things Karoline stood for with their own evolving views of inclusivity and social justice. Ellen's voice came out, almost a whisper, but with an edge that spoke volumes. I just can't help but wonder, Karoline, if you think you're above it all, above the conversation, above the progress. Isn't that what a lot of people see when they hear your rhetoric? A refusal to engage with the world as it is? A refusal to adapt? Karoline's face remained impassive, but her eyes darkened slightly. I'm not above anyone, Ellen, but I'm not going to sit idly by and let the world redefine what it means to be American, to be free, and to be faithful. A sharp breath cut through the tension in the air as Ellen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She wasn't used to being on the defensive. The audience, sensing the shift, began to murmur again, some whispering to each other, some looking at their phones to catch up on the conversation that was unfolding on social media. It was clear that this wasn't just another celebrity interview. This was a clash of ideologies, a battle over the very future of the nation's values, played out on live television. The commercial break ended too soon for Ellen. She wasn't ready for the next round of questions, but the show must go on, and she had no choice but to press on. Okay, we're back, Ellen said, forcing a chuckle, trying to shake off the moment that had lingered too long. Let's move on to something else, shall we? We've got to lighten things up. But Karoline wasn't about to let the conversation be deflected so easily. I don't think we should move on, Ellen, she said, her voice steady but firm. I think we've started a conversation that needs to happen, a conversation that's too important to brush aside. The studio paused. This time, it wasn't just the awkward silence, it was the palpable feeling that something bigger was at stake. The battle for the narrative was unfolding in real time, and the tension between the two women, the divide between their worlds, couldn't be ignored anymore. And in the audience, a growing sense of unease settled over the room. No one was sure where this conversation would end, but one thing was certain. The stakes were higher than either of them had anticipated. As the show resumed, the tension between Ellen and Karoline hung in the air like an unspoken promise. Ellen forced a smile, trying to regain control, but the cracks in her facade were beginning to show. She wasn't just up against an opponent on the other side of the desk. She was confronting a tidal wave of ideas that threatened to wash away everything she had built on her stage, her platform. Her audience, which had once been captivated by her charm and light-hearted wit, now seemed unsure, caught between their allegiance to Ellen and the power of Karoline's unyielding convictions. Let's switch gears a bit, Ellen said, her voice tight but attempting to retain its usual warmth. I want to talk about your campaign, about your run for office. You've been vocal about a lot of things, but what is it that you're really hoping to change?" Karoline's eyes sparkled with the fire of someone who knew the answer before the question was even asked. She didn't hesitate. "I'm hoping to change the direction of this country. We've been steered into a place where values are no longer respected, where the hard work of everyday people is overlooked in favor of political games and social media spectacles. I want to bring this country back to what it was built on: freedom, faith, and a sense of shared responsibility." The camera zoomed in on Karoline's face as she spoke, capturing every word. She wasn't just an average politician. She was someone who had tapped into the deep-rooted fears and desires of an American public that felt disconnected from the modern world. Every syllable she uttered struck a chord with some, a string pulled in a heart that longed for a simpler time. A time when America's promise was untainted by the complexities of modern politics. Ellen, however, wasn't convinced. "But don't you think that view of the past, this idealized version of America, is flawed? Aren't we ignoring the progress we've made? The inclusivity we've fought for?" Ellen's words were edged with frustration. She had heard these arguments before, but this time it felt different. This wasn't just a soundbite or a debate. It was a deep ideological divide that had been exposed in real time, in front of millions of people. Karoline leaned in, her expression hardening. "Progress doesn't mean leaving people behind, Ellen. It doesn't mean rewriting the history of this country just to fit a narrative. Real progress is about elevating everyone, not just a select few who have the loudest voices." The audience shifted in their seats, unsure how to react. Some nodded in agreement with Karoline, while others squirmed, feeling the weight of the conversation pulling them in two different directions. Ellen's show had always been a safe space, a place for lighthearted fun and celebrity gossip, but now it was a battleground. The cameras panned to the audience, capturing their mixed expressions. The smiles had faded, replaced by a mixture of uncertainty, confusion, and contemplation. This wasn't just entertainment anymore. This was a reckoning, a clash of ideologies that would have rippling consequences far beyond the confines of the stage. Ellen tried to press on, her voice a little strained now. "But what about people who feel marginalized by those values, Karoline? What about people who don't see themselves reflected in your vision of America? What do you say to them?" Karoline's response was immediate, cutting through Ellen's words like a blade. "I say, stop being silenced. Stop allowing a few loud voices to dictate the direction of your life. Everyone deserves to be heard, Ellen, but not everyone deserves to have their ideas pushed on everyone else. We've got to stop pretending that we can change the core of this nation just because it doesn't fit a particular narrative. We can't erase the past to build a future." The words hung heavy in the air, each one deliberate and filled with the weight of a conviction that could not be easily swayed. Ellen could feel the walls closing in around her. She had made her career on championing inclusivity, but Karoline's stark rejection of that very concept was impossible to ignore. The truth was, the more Karoline spoke, the more it became clear. This wasn't just about a political disagreement. It was about a fundamental difference in worldviews. "I'm not trying to erase anyone, Karoline," Ellen said, her voice shaking slightly now, the cracks in her confidence widening. "I'm trying to bring people together, not tear them apart." Karoline's gaze softened, but there was no compromise in her voice. "I'm not here to tear people apart either, Ellen. I'm here to stand up for those who've been forgotten, the ones whose voices have been drowned out by the loudest people in the room." For a moment, the studio fell into an eerie silence. The weight of their words had silenced even the audience, leaving nothing but the buzz of tension that filled the space. This was no longer just an interview. This was a confrontation of worldviews, a battle for the very soul of the country, laid bare for millions to watch. Ellen glanced at the producer standing off stage, a silent plea in her eyes. They had both crossed into dangerous territory, and she wasn't sure how much further she could go without pushing the show beyond its breaking point. But it was too late. The conversation had taken on a life of its own, and there was no turning back. "I think it's time for another break," Ellen said, her voice unsteady as she turned toward the camera. "We'll be right back after this. Stay tuned." As the cameras cut away, the tension in the air didn't dissipate. It lingered, hanging like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. Outside the studio, the world was already reacting. Social media was ablaze with reactions, each side claiming victory, each side further entrenched in their views. But inside the studio, both women knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Their confrontation had already become bigger than just a TV show. It had become a symbol, a moment that would echo far beyond the walls of Ellen's stage. The show's final moments passed in a blur, with Ellen trying her best to maintain control as Karoline's words echoed in the air. The camera's bright lights now felt like a spotlight on the raw tension between them. As the final commercial break ended, Ellen and Karoline sat in silence, their eyes locked in a quiet battle. It was clear that neither of them had come out unscathed. Ellen cleared her throat, visibly struggling to regain her composure. "Well, that was certainly intense," she said, her voice faltering as she looked directly into the camera. "But that's what happens when we discuss real issues, right? A little discomfort is part of the conversation." She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Karoline, however, was far from fazed. She sat back in her chair, her expression cool and collected, a quiet strength emanating from her. "Discomfort is where change begins, Ellen. If people aren't uncomfortable, they're not paying attention." The camera zoomed in on Karoline as she spoke, her calm demeanor only heightening the impact of her words. She had made her point, and she had made it with precision. Ellen had tried to be the voice of reason, but Karoline had stood firm, unyielding in her belief that America needed to return to its roots. As the cameras stopped rolling and the applause began to die down, Ellen's face fell. The studio buzzed with the energy of the audience, but the tension in the room was palpable. Behind the scenes, producers were already discussing what would come next. The fallout from the interview had begun before the show had even finished airing. Outside the studio, social media erupted. Karoline's supporters hailed her as a hero, a true patriot who had finally spoken the truth. They shared clips of her calm rebuttals, her unwavering stance on the values that defined America. Hashtags like #Karoline 2024 and #TruePatriot began trending, flooding Twitter feeds, creating a groundswell of support that reached far beyond the boundaries of the show's viewership. On the other hand, Ellen's fans, who had once found solace in her light-hearted banter and inclusive messages, now felt betrayed. They flooded her Instagram and Twitter accounts with criticism, accusing her of being unprepared, of allowing someone with such divisive views to hijack her show. Ellen had prided herself on being the voice of reason in a world that seemed increasingly polarized, but now she was the face of an interview that had exposed just how deep those divisions ran. As the day wore on, Ellen's team worked tirelessly behind the scenes to try and salvage the situation. Crisis management teams were called in. Statements were drafted, revised, and re-revised. A live stream apology was scheduled for the next day, but Ellen knew deep down that no amount of damage control could undo what had just transpired. The public was already moving on, into another battle, another divisive issue, another argument. Meanwhile, Karoline reveled in the chaos she had created. She wasn't just another guest on a talk show, she had become a force. The interview had been her platform, and she had used it with precision, never allowing Ellen's deflection tactics to throw her off course. The rising star of conservative politics had made her mark. It was no longer just about policy. It was about branding, about standing up to the establishment, and about making sure that no one could ignore her message. For Karoline, the future was bright. Her campaign for office was gaining momentum, and the media couldn't get enough of her. Every word, every statement she made was amplified and dissected. Karoline was no longer just a political figure, she was a cultural icon, and this interview would go down in history as the moment when she made her boldest statement yet. In the hours following the show, the media landscape shifted. News outlets covered the fallout extensively, with pundits offering their analysis of the interview. Some declared Ellen's inability to regain control a sign of the declining influence of traditional media. Others marveled at Karoline's ability to stay composed under pressure, calling her a new kind of politician, a politician who wasn't afraid to speak uncomfortable truths. For Ellen, the experience left a bitter taste in her mouth. She had faced hard-hitting interviews before, but nothing like this. Nothing that had shaken her so deeply, made her feel so vulnerable in front of millions of viewers. The worst part? The show had ended in a draw. Neither Karoline nor Ellen had truly won the day. The audience was left to decide for themselves. Later that night, Ellen sat alone in her dressing room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She had spent years cultivating her image as someone who brought people together, who used her platform to foster understanding and inclusivity. Now, her brand had been irrevocably altered. The show had always been her safe space, a place where she could control the narrative. But tonight, the narrative had slipped from her grasp. The sound of her phone buzzing broke her reverie. It was a message from her producer. "The backlash is real. We need to address this tomorrow." Ellen's fingers hovered over the screen. She could already hear the outcry. People would demand answers. They would want her to choose a side, to pick a lane. The problem was, she wasn't sure where she stood anymore. Karoline had made her intentions clear. She had played the game brilliantly, and now the whole world was watching. The episode had been more than just a confrontation. It had been a watershed moment. For both women, it was the beginning of something much bigger than they had anticipated. It was a moment of reckoning, a moment where they had each defined their future, and neither of them would ever be the same. As Ellen sat in the quiet darkness of her dressing room, she realized the truth. This was only the beginning, and the stakes were higher than they had ever been.